Hello again and welcome back. Great to have you here. We are doing another lecture here on topic 3.8 and 3.9, the Constitutional Convention and debates over ratification, and then also the Constitution itself. The theme that we're focusing on today is politics and power. There is going to be two learning objectives. The very first one is 3I, explain the differing ideological positions on the structure and function of the federal government. So let's start with the Constitutional Convention here. Delegates from the states participated in the Constitutional Convention and through negotiation, collaboration, and compromise proposed a constitution. The beginnings of this convention happened the year previous. In 1786, there was supposed to be another convention at Annapolis in Maryland in which they were going to address some of the economic problems that the Articles of Confederation were having, like the lack of power on taxation by the central government, the tariffs that the different states were putting on each other, hampering interstate commerce, and the lack of a common currency. But the problem at Annapolis was that not enough states sent delegates, and so they weren't able to have a convention because they did not have a quorum, that is a majority in order to make changes. And so they planned for the next year in 1787. They said, we're going to do this again, but instead of focusing on just economic issues, we're going to try to make more amendments to the Articles of Confederation. That's how it was portrayed at first, that this was only going to make changes to the current articles. They were not proposing to create a new form of government. So 12 out of the 13 states sent delegates, and the Constitution that comes out of the convention is based primarily on Madison's Virginia plan, and it's got three branches of government. As soon as James Madison got there, he knew in his head that they were going to have to start over, that trying to amend the Articles of Confederation was going to be too difficult, and then if they did manage to agree on something at the convention, getting those amendments passed would require a unanimous vote by all of the states, and so it was better to just start from scratch. They were essentially overthrowing the government and trying to put a new government in place. So that's why they had to do it secretly. They met at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. And a couple of the issues that the delegates had was over the size of the central government compared to the states, and also the amount of democracy that they would allow, because at this time, democracy is still not seen as a positive thing the way that we see it today. They wanted to make sure that only the people that had a stake in the country and that had a certain level of education were the ones that were going to have the most power in government. So in order to fix this issue or this debate on representation within the central government, we have the Connecticut Compromise. So it settles the issue of representation with a bicameral legislature. It creates one house that is going to give delegates for every state based on the population size. So the states with a larger population are going to have more representatives, and the states with fewer people inside of them are going to have fewer delegates. And then on the other house, the one that we call the Senate, they are going to have two representatives go to that house regardless of the population size in every state. So two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, together we call them Congress, and each of them is going to award delegates based on different criteria. So the House based on the population size, and the Senate is going to give two automatic senators for every state. Another one of these compromises is the creation of the Electoral College. So the states wanted to continue to have some importance in this new form of government. In the old form of government, in the Articles of Confederation, the states were the most important part. They had most of the power. And with the Constitution, they are going to be giving up a lot of it. So they want to have some importance, and the way that they inject that importance into the Constitution is through the creation of the Electoral College. So every state is going to have a number of electoral votes equal to the amount of representatives and senators that they hold. And then those electoral votes are going to be cast for that state for the president. So the population, the popular vote, is not going to directly impact the presidential election. It's only going to indirectly impact the presidential election, because if the electoral college for a certain state wants to vote for a candidate that the rest of the states doesn't want, they can still continue to cast that ballot independent of the popular vote. All right, we had compromises on slavery because slavery is going to continue here. The Constitutional Convention compromised over the representation of slave states in Congress and the role of the federal government in regulating both slavery and the slave trade, allowing the prohibition of the international slave trade after 1808. So the first of these compromises that the Southern states asked for was the 3/5 compromise. Now that representation in Congress was going to be based on population, the Southern states wanted all of the enslaved people in their states to count as people that would yield them more representation. The northern states balked at this. They said, how can you count them as regular people for your count if you keep them enslaved, if you are taking away their rights? And so they came up with a 3/5 compromise that every enslaved person in a southern state or any state would count as 3/5 of a person for the methods to determine representation in the House of Representatives. So the southern states wanted to have it both ways. They wanted to have their enslaved population, and they also wanted to have that enslaved population count towards their representation. And so this is going to set a precedent for the next 70, 80 years in American history that southern states are going to have overrepresentation in Congress because the enslaved population is counting towards their representation, despite that enslaved population not having any rights of voting or liberty. Now, the next compromise was one that was trying to secure human property for southern states. So the Fugitive Slave Clause in Article 4 guaranteed the return of a runaway if he or she crossed state lines. So it's guaranteed that just because a runaway enslaved person went to a different state, that they no longer would be in bondage. If they were caught, they would be returned back to the enslaver. And then finally, the last compromise is a delay in banning the international slave trade. In the Constitution, there is a clause that says that the international or the importation of enslaved people from abroad cannot be debated or legislated on for 20 years. Now, these compromises, as dehumanizing as they are, were necessary for the southern states to agree upon the new constitution. If these compromises were not there, it's unlikely that the southern states would have gone along with the new constitution, and they would have had to revert back to the Articles of Confederation. So it's we don't know exactly what it would have been like if they had not been put in place, but they certainly will have an impact. These clauses, these compromises will have an impact on American life for the next, at least the next 60 years, and then we see some of the reverberations of these impacts in today's society. All right, now that the Constitution is written, all the compromises have been hammered out, there is going to be debate over its ratification. So in the debates over ratifying the Constitution, anti-federalists opposing ratification battled with federalists whose principles were articulated in the Federalist Papers, primarily written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. So the anti-federalists were the ones who did not want to ratify the Constitution. They wanted to keep things as they were with the Articles of Confederation. In that system, the states had more power, and they were scared of a central government that was too powerful. So that was okay with them, for the central government to be weak under the Articles. They believed that state sovereignty and individual liberties would be infringed if this new constitution was ratified. They thought that by virtue of giving too much power to the central government, it would infringe upon individual liberties. There was no clause or no document inside of the Constitution that guaranteed specific individual liberties other than habeas corpus and denying the creation of ex post facto laws. Other than that, there was no guarantee of individual liberties. They would have to rely on the Bill of Rights within the state constitutions or hope that there would be a Bill of Rights written later on. The Federalists are the ones who wanted the Constitution to be ratified, and then they will also turn into one of the first political parties in the new government. So they believe that the central government needed to be stronger to improve the economy, to improve the defense of the United States, to fix all of the problems that they had seen under the Articles of Confederation. This establishes a new system of governing called federalism. That is one in which you have a strong central government that is responsible for certain tasks in society, and it divides those other tasks in society with the state governments. The Federalists believed that federalism and the separation of powers within the Federalist system was ensuring people against tyranny, that the power had been subdivided so evenly and so effectively that it would be impossible for any one branch or any one group to take control of the government and act in a tyrannical way. All of this is vocalized through the Federalist Papers. So it was 85 essays written by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay. So the majority of these were written by Alexander Hamilton. That's why he's more prominent on this picture. And they were printed across different states and newspapers to garner support. Now, the Federalists had an advantage here in that most people who owned printing presses agreed with the viewpoint of the Federalist Papers, while not as many printers agreed with anti-Federalist. And there was a set of anti-Federalist papers that were printed as a response to the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were written under the pseudonym of Publius, which stands for the voice of the people, and the Anti-Federalist Papers were written by someone under the pseudonym of Brutus. So hearkening back to the story of Julius Caesar and Brutus being one of the first people to stab Caesar in the back to ensure that he does not become a tyrannical ruler over Rome. So the metaphor would have been very obvious to the people reading the Anti-Federalist Papers. All right, continuing on this ratification debate. So the Federalists ensured that the ratification of the Constitution by promising the addition of a Bill of Rights that enumerated individual rights and explicitly restricted the powers of the federal government. So the Federalists catered to what the Anti-Federalists were afraid of. They were afraid of individual liberties being infringed upon, and so therefore they say that if ratification happens, the very first thing that they will do is to write a Bill of Rights and ratify it and make sure that individual liberties are protected. It's not that the Federalists did not believe that individual rights were important. It's not that they didn't think that that was something that should have been a part of a form of government. The reason why it was not included in the original draft of the Constitution is because they simply ran out of time in Philadelphia that summer in 1787. They had a lot to get through. The debates and the compromises took a long time, and so there was not enough time to have a complete form of government. There are 12 amendments to the Constitution that are introduced in that first congressional session, and 10 of those amendments are ratified. They're all written by James Madison. Per Article 7 of the Constitution, only 9 out of the 13 states needed to ratify it, but it was critical that all 13 states would eventually ratify it. Otherwise, there would be some states that get left out. And so the political cartoon that you see on the bottom here was one drawn by Benjamin Franklin. And every time that a new state would ratify the Constitution, he would add another pillar to his little cartoon. So you see in this one, there's only 2 states that remain, North Carolina and Rhode Island. And so here he is giving you the imagery that it is important that all of these are, that all these states are ratifying the Constitution. He even puts in some religious imagery. You see that North Carolina is being lifted by some godly hand. And he's pointing to the importance of Rhode Island also ratifying the Constitution, saying the foundation good, it may yet be saved. So he wants to make sure that Rhode Island has a chance to come in, and they eventually do ratify the Constitution in May of 1790. At this point, the first congressional session has already begun, but better late than never, right? All right, our last learning objective here is 3J, explain the continuities and changes in the structure and functions of the government with the ratification of the Constitution. So here's where you're going to have to be doing some comparison as to what the government was like before with the Articles of Confederation, and then what it was like after with the Constitution, what stayed the same, and what changed from one form of government to the other. So here are some of the things that stay the same and also changed. So the delegates from the states participated in the Constitutional Convention that created a limited but dynamic central government embodying federalism and providing for a separation of powers between its three branches. So one of the things that remained the same is that both of these governments were built upon popular sovereignty. So the Constitution begins with the preamble of "we the people." That is a significant phrase in the Constitution because it is automatically giving the power to the people. It begins with "we the people." It doesn't say "we the states of New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Georgia, South Carolina." It begins with "we the people." So it means that the people are going to be the ones that form this government, and the government is going to be ultimately accountable to the people. Something else that is similar to the Articles of Confederation is that there was still a sense of limited government here. And the way that the Constitution provided that limited government was through checks and balances. So through the separation of powers, assured restraint on government. Now, the Articles of Confederation didn't have checks and balances because they really didn't have separate branches in the central government. They only had a legislature, a quote unquote president of the legislature, and no judiciary. But it wasn't divided as much as it was here in the Constitution, primarily because they didn't have as much power to divide. Now, the Bill of Rights protected individual liberties. That's another way in which the Constitution limited the powers of government. It forbade the government from creating certain laws that would infringe upon individual liberties. And now here's something that is new. It created this dynamic central government. That's the wording from the AP College Board. Dynamic, in this sense, means that it can grow when it needs to. So the necessary and proper clause in Article 1 of the Constitution, when it's describing the powers of Congress, it leaves the opportunity for expansion of power as needed. So anytime that Congress needs to expand its power to carry out one of its objectives, as stated by the Constitution, they are allowed to do so. And that's going to be used over time to where the power of the federal government is going to grow and grow and grow to where it is today, where it's very, very powerful, especially when you compare it to the power of the state governments. Federalism was a completely new phenomenon here in our US government, having a stronger central government that was made up of these state governments that had lesser powers. So the power structure here maintained the importance of the states in certain issues, but in all cases, or in most cases, the federal government was supreme. And so this is also explicitly listed in the Constitution. The Supremacy Clause says that whenever there are laws between the states and the federal government that are contradictory, it is going to be the laws of the federal government that are going to reign supreme, so long as the federal government has the power given to create that kind of law. There are some laws that the federal government cannot create because those are reserved to the states, but that's the Supremacy Clause. All right, so let's do a quick recap. So the Constitution's final draft came out of many compromises. The Southern states won protections on slavery. Federalists and Anti-Federalists emerged as the two sides in the ratification debates. The Federalist won. Ratification was assured with the promise of a Bill of Rights written by James Madison, and the Constitution created a federalist system with protections against abuses of power. All right, so that is all you need to know here for the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention from which it came out of. Please come back for the next lecture in which we talk about how the Constitution is being put into practice in the first presidential administration of George Washington. All right, that is it for today. I will see you on the next lecture. Thank you.